Hi everybody, I'm going to show you how to do the Evolution Nova Lab. Now before I start on explaining how you're going to build the trees for each mission, I do want to play the videos because it's important for us to understand the process of how it works. So I don't want us to just be playing a game just to get points. The whole point of this is for us to understand how the process of evolution works. So when you click on that link for the Evolution Lab, you're going to see this option here. So I do want to introduce you to the video on this topic here. So I will stop and let's see here. I am going to be stopping to explain the video, so you can just pay attention for now.
Okay, go to the window, or better yet, step outside. A squirrel darts past. Trees and weeds surge up towards the sky. Birds tickle the air. Get down on the ground and there's more. Worms wriggling, mushrooms sprouting, beetles crawling. There's stuff you can't even see, like bacteria. And everywhere you go on this planet, on land, underground, in the air, and in the water, there's more life to be found. And all of it, even you, is shaped by the most incredible of forces. Evolution.
Evolution essentially multiplies majesty by majesty by majesty.
And our understanding of all that majesty, it goes back to the mid-1800s when an English 20-something, a guy named Charles Darwin, got an invitation he couldn't refuse.
To travel around the world. It was 5 years, and that voyage made him into a thinker.
He was just a great naturalist. He saw things out in nature and he asked why.
As in, why is there such a stunning diversity of life? Why are similar looking species sometimes located on opposite sides of the planet? It was Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace who independently puzzled out a mechanism behind evolution.
Which was natural selection.
Natural selection.
So one of the things I want to point out really quickly between Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace is that mainly Charles Darwin is the one that receives most of the credit for the discovery of evolution. Alfred Russel Wallace also played a major role. So both of these scientists actually discovered the process of natural selection as they were studying different species. But because Charles Darwin came from an affluent family, meaning a family that had money, Charles Darwin realized when Russel Wallace tried to get in contact with him that, hey, this guy discovered the same thing that I did. And so if I don't publish my book here, so Darwin kind of sat on his idea for over 10 years because he was scared of what people were going to think. So he sat on that idea, and what motivated him to finally publish what he had discovered and the amount of data that he had collected was a letter that he received from Alfred Russel Wallace telling him, look, this is what I've discovered. And so he wanted to make sure that he was the one that got the credit for it, and so he decided to finally publish. But Alfred Wallace also contributed to our knowledge of natural selection. It's just Charles Darwin is the one that gets most of the credit for that.
It just means that nature, the natural environment, is what's selecting which organisms survive long enough to reproduce, and it depends on two key ingredients. The first is some way of getting features or traits to be inherited from one generation to the next, which usually means reproduction. The second is variation. If organisms were to make exact duplicates of themselves every time they reproduced, nothing would change. There'd be no elephants, no pine trees, no humans. We'd still just be single-celled proto-organisms. Now, the environment can't support every individual that's born. Maybe it's too dry or too wet for some of them. Maybe all the food's up in tall trees. Maybe there's not enough food, or maybe it's just really cold. Whatever it is, organisms compete for resources, and this is where selection comes in.
So one of the things I want to point out is that genetic variation within a population is very important here. Every individual that's born has slightly varied genetics from individual to individual. And so natural selection is going to be acting on those slight differences. Sometimes those slight differences provide a selective advantage to that individual that allows it to be able to survive and have more babies when compared to other individuals from that population. And so if it's more successful, then it's going to be able to pass on its genes, its DNA, to more individuals, more offspring. So the population will shift towards having this particular characteristic that allows them to be able to survive and reproduce more.
For instance, scientists believe that a few 100,000 years ago, before there were polar bears, some brown bears got stranded in the Arctic. The few that survived likely had fur coats that were a bit thicker and lighter in color than the others. That would have kept them warmer and helped them blend in with the snow to sneak up on prey more easily. The point is, not all variations make it.
And the things that survive go on to reproduce.
In other words, survival of the fittest, which doesn't necessarily mean the biggest or the strongest.
Fittest, in an evolutionary sense, is whoever has the most descendants.
In the Arctic, the bears with thicker and whiter coats survived more often and had more offspring that inherited the thicker and whiter fur. And gradually, other changes accumulated too, until this population became a separate species from the brown bears.
So I want to point out that evolution doesn't mean that one species just turns into another one. It involves many generations, so this involves time. And so those characteristics, those variations that allow those individuals to survive are what's passed on. And over many generations, those characteristics become more pronounced in the population.
However, if we were to swap out the snow for a forest, having polar bear-like fur would likely be a bad thing. In other words, evolution doesn't progress in one fixed direction, but it's not entirely random either. With so many environments selecting for all kinds of traits, evolution has resulted in the countless species that have lived on Earth. Now, Darwin wrote these ideas down.
He was not a visual man.
So when he did bother to draw something, people took notice, like this image he sketched in one of his notebooks.
It's a tree.
And it tells us how things are related. That is, they all can be traced back to a common ancestor.
That ancestor, the first living organism on our planet, is at the base of the tree trunk. Here's another view of this so-called phylogenetic tree. As life's evolved over the last 3.8 billion years, new species have branched off, leading to entire lineages of different organisms.
Every branching point in that tree is a story.
Stories of global domination, of extinction, stories of beauty, and of remarkable adaptation to an ever-changing world.
I mean, the goal of the Tree of Life is to try to understand how every species is related to each other. The breadth of this, that is amazing.
And that's where you come in. In Nova's Evolution Lab, you'll be climbing around the Tree of Life to build out portions of that tree, to see how evolution really works and understand why it matters to you. Like, did you eat a dinosaur last night for dinner? Can you save someone from a venomous snake bite? Or do you have a Neanderthal ancestor? Play this lab. Build the Tree of Life, which is your family tree, and discover just how connected you are to everything that's alive and everything that's ever lived.
Okay, so that's a good little intro there. So we're going to go ahead and click on where it says play game. So since you guys are going to be logging in for the first time, it's going to give you an option to log in with your Gmail. Make sure that you do that, okay? If you've already taken this class and you've completed some of the missions, I want you to replay the missions because they're going to be good practice for you since we are going to be testing you on this on any upcoming quizzes or benchmarks, okay? So I highly encourage you guys to replay those missions if you've already taken this class before. So we're going to start off with mission 1. Now for me, all of this is highlighted because I've already played and passed all of the missions, but I'm going to click on replay for mission 1. What you'll find is that it doesn't let you move on to the second mission until you've completed the first one. So we're going to start off with training trees. Even the most basic evolutionary trees reveal deep insights into how different forms of life are connected. So it's going to explain how we're going to get started here with building our training trees.
Let's talk tree basics.
An evolutionary phylogenetic tree is a depiction of how different species are related to each other.
We'll start with just one branch, which represents a single species, like cushioned sea stars or human beings. The top of that branch contains all the individual organisms of that species, so all people or all cushioned sea.
One thing I want you guys to notice is that a branch represents the entire species. I know that within that population of that species, there's so much variety, right? There's different colors, and those different colors are coded for by differences in their genes. That's called genetic variation. And so when we talk about evolution, genetic variation is important. It's what natural selection acts on during this process.
Sea stars. If we travel along a branch back in time,
You come to common ancestors of species when two branches come together.
now let's roll time forward instead. This split point represents the evolutionary moment when a common ancestor species diverged into two distinct species, a process called speciation. As time goes on, you get more splitting, more species, and more biodiversity, until you get a tree that looks something like this.
It's a hierarchical arrangement of how those organisms originated and who they are more closely related to.
A tree isn't a literal timeline, but it does show the passing of time.
More ancient branches occur deeper in the tree, and more recent splits occur closer to the tips.
For each puzzle in this lab, you'll be organizing a collection of species into a tree. Start by using the magnifying glass to learn about the organisms. Explore the species screens and the comparison screen to track down the characteristics or traits that different groups of species have in common. Now, not all traits are useful for analyzing evolutionary relationships, but not to worry, we've made sure to give you mostly informative ones. After you've gathered the information you need, build your tree by dragging species icons and then traits into the center of the screen. In general, the more closely related the species, the more traits they share. Deeper branch points connect species that are more distantly related and have fewer traits in common. When you position a trait, that location on the tree corresponds to the common ancestor where that trait first arose. Earn up to 2 leaves in every puzzle, 1 for completing the tree, and 1 for getting the quiz question right. The more leaves you get, the more complex you can make your fractal tree, which tracks your progress through the lab. After you finish each puzzle, you'll unlock the next one, or open up a whole new mission, and you'll discover something about the living world pulsing all around you.
Okay, so let's go ahead and get started with the first one. So the first tree, we're going to be figuring out what the relationship is between a red, green, and geckos in particular. So here are 2 different species. So far we have a palm tree and a gecko. We're going to need to drag the species into the screen here to begin our tree. Okay. So I'm going to drag this characteristic. So these here on the left, you'll see a little circle with a description. These are characteristics of species. So cells with the nuclei is a characteristic that all species have. Actually, not all species, I'm sorry. Not bacteria. So bacteria actually have cells, but they don't have a nucleus. And so this characteristic applies to both a gecko and a palm tree because they are made up of cells that have a nucleus. If you look here on the right, it says, good job, you have successfully built your first phylogenetic tree. Both the gecko and the palm tree have cells with a nucleus. So you're going to click on next. We're given another species now, fly agaric. So I'm going to click on the little magnifying glass so I can learn more about the species here. I see some terms that maybe you may not be familiar with: photosynthetic, autotroph, or heterotrophic. So we're definitely going to click on that magnifying glass so we can learn more about the species. So I'll start off with the mushroom here, the fly agaric mushroom. Now, if you look here, it has some descriptions, like this mushroom has cells with a nuclei. And here it says that it's heterotrophic, meaning that it obtains nutrients by consuming other organisms. Okay, so make that note in your head about what the descriptions of the species are. Now let's look at the gecko. Here it says that the gecko has cells with a nuclei. Hey, didn't the mushroom have that too? Okay, so that's one characteristic that the mushroom and the gecko both share. Here it says that the gecko is heterotrophic, meaning that it obtains nutrients and energy by consuming other organisms. Wasn't that also a characteristic of the mushroom? Okay, and now let's look at the palm tree. The palm tree has cells with a nuclei, just like the other two species did. The palm tree is a photosynthetic autotroph, meaning that it uses energy from sunlight to turn carbon dioxide and water into sugar. Okay, so now that I read about those 3 different species, this is what the cells look like. Okay, now you might be tempted, you're going to need to place the mushroom onto the tree, but you're going to probably be tempted to put the mushroom here with the tree. Okay, now, all of these have a cells with a nuclei. Notice how the blue button kind of lit up for all of these. That's because they all have that trait. You're going to be tempted to put the mushroom next to the palm tree because the mushroom looks like a plant a little bit, right? But if you remember looking at the magnifying glass and reading those descriptions, the mushroom actually is not photosynthetic. The palm tree is photosynthetic, meaning that it can carry out the process of photosynthesis, but the mushroom can't do that. Notice how the pink button for photosynthetic autotroph, that characteristic falls off because the mushroom doesn't have that. Now, before I try to move the mushroom, I'm going to look at this characteristic, heterotrophic. If you remember from the description, it said these are organisms that obtain nutrients from consuming other organisms. So I'm going to place that here with the gecko and see if that fits there. So it looks like it lit up. That means the gecko is heterotrophic. And I can confirm that by going back to the magnifying glass and reading those descriptions again if I wanted to. But my tree isn't right because I have the mushroom here next to the palm tree. I'm going to need to move the mushroom over because the mushroom is not photosynthetic. Okay? Something's missing here. So I'm going to need to move this characteristic, heterotrophic, below so that it fits both of these because this is a trait that's unique to both species, not just the gecko. So now that you've completed the first puzzle, answer the question, is an animal or a plant more closely related to a fungus? So based off of what we just did here, the fungus is more closely related to the animal. It's heterotrophic. Okay. So that was the first one. I want you to try out the next tree, Familiar Faces, Tree of Life. Try that out and see how it goes. All right, I'm going to go back to the home button so that I can have you get started on mission 2. So you do need to complete mission 1 before you can move on to mission 2. Okay, so I do want you guys to play the video, Fossils Rocking the Earth. Use fossil clues buried inside of rocks to unlock the history of life on our planet. So let me play this here for you guys.
How do we know that 2 species are related if their common ancestor is no longer alive? How do we know what happened on Earth before humans showed up? Sometimes the answers to questions like these are right beneath our feet. Look in the right place and you'll find fossils, traces of organisms that were once alive and that with time were preserved, usually in rocks. And here's the remarkable thing.
When we get fossils out of the ground, they have features that are shared with features found in living organisms.
So tucked away inside rocks that are thousands or millions of
Hey, there's the law of superposition. Remember we learned about that just the other day.
years old, we find fossils of bones and shells and leaves that resemble those in organisms alive today. They give us a record of how life on Earth has changed over time. It's not complete, however, because not all organisms get preserved and not all fossils get found.
remember the other day we talked about, what are some the special conditions that need to be met in order for fossils to form? So it takes really special conditions. We learned about the process of how fossils form, those steps that need to happen in order for them to form. And so having fossils allows us to be able to see those changes from one layer to the next. And when we look at layers, like we notice that certain species are gone, giving us hints that an extinction might have happened during this time. So we can learn a lot in the fossil record. We can compare species from one layer to the next and look at how those populations, those species changed over time.
So the more of these fossils we have that we can place on the tree, the more it tells us of when different features of organisms evolved.
Pull a fossil of a dinosaur femur or thigh bone out of a rock layer that's, say, 68 million years old, and you know that dinosaur must have lived about 68 million years ago. And you can compare it to the femurs of animals both extinct and alive today, which will give you an idea of how those organisms are related, and how the femur in particular has been adapted to suit new organisms in new environments over and over again. The fossil record provides strong evidence for evolution. It shows us that evolutionary change tends to be gradual. It gives us physical proof of extinction and of single species splitting into two. And it contains creatures that are transitional forms between one group of species and another. This is where you're being sent now, to a place where living things become rocks, and those rocks become clues that tether the ancient Earth to the modern one. Prepare to dig.
All right, let's get digging. So we're going to start off with the first one, eating dinosaurs for dinner. What? Yes, you've probably ate a dinosaur for dinner, or a relative of dinosaurs, maybe in the past week or two. Okay, so I have all these characteristics: two-fingered hand, shafted feathers, toothless beak, wishbone. Whoa, I'm not even sure what these things are. Some of these are characteristics that I've never heard of before, and here I have all these species. Now, it's okay if you're not sure who these dinosaurs are. Albertosaurus, Archaeopteryx, chicken, ostrich, and T-Rex. A reminder that you have the magnifying glass here to be able to read up on what are some characteristics that these species have. So here I have the T-Rex, and it tells me that the T-Rex had two-fingered hands for catching prey. Okay. It also had a wishbone as part of its skeletal structure. The ostrich has a beak without teeth. It has feathers along its body, and it also has a wishbone as part of its skeletal structure, just like the T-Rex did. You go to the chicken. The chicken has a beak without teeth. Hey, that was a trait that also the ostrich had. It has feathers along its body. The ostrich had that as well. And it has a wishbone as part of its skeletal structure. So far it looks like the chicken, the ostrich, and the T-Rex all have a wishbone as a part of their skeletal structure. Archaeopteryx. So this is a species that is since it's extinct. But this fossil and many fossils of Archaeopteryx have allowed us to discover that this is the transitional species between dinosaurs and modern day birds. So Archaeopteryx had feathers along its body. We can tell because of the impressions that were left in the fossil. And it also had a wishbone as part of its skeletal structure. Albertosaurus had two-fingered hands for catching prey. Hey, I think I remember the two-fingered hands being common with the T-Rex. Now, if you're like me and you probably forget what those traits were for those species, I would write them down. In fact, when I first played this game, that's what I was doing. I was writing them down, like who has what, because it helped me to be able to build a tree. Now, the T-Rex also had a wishbone as part of its skeletal structure. So one thing I did know is that all of these species had a wishbone as a part of its skeletal structure. So I'm going to click out of here. I'm just going to place any random species on here and start off with this trait here, the wishbone. Okay, so I'm going to put that below. I'm going to drag all the other species here. I don't know. I'll start working on who's more closely related here in just a bit. I'm just randomly putting them on there, but I do know that The wishbone is a trait that all of them have. So I need to place that trait on the very bottom of the tree because all of those species share that. The more ancient traits, we place them on the bottom of the tree, and this implies that all of those species share that trait. And then there's going to be traits that distinguish and separate these. Off the top of my head, I think I remember the chicken and ostrich sharing some characteristics, so I'm going to place those together. Now, you can go back to the magnifying glass, or if you are taking notes on what the characteristics of these species are, you can certainly do that as well. I'm going to go ahead and combine T-Rex and Albertosaurus. Okay, so notice how it still lights up because they all share those characteristics. The two-fingered hand, I think the T-Rex had that. I can't remember if Albertosaurus had that, but I'm going to place that here. Let's see if it lights up for Albertosaurus. Oh, it did. Okay, cool. Shafted feathers. I can't remember. Well, chicken and ostrich, for sure, they have feathers. And I think Archaeopteryx was that one species that was the link between dinosaurs and the modern bird. So I'm going to put this one here in the middle. You can go back to the magnifying glass and double check. Oh, and it looks like it lights up. Okay. I also remember seeing something about the beak. It doesn't have any teeth. So the chicken and the ostrich have that trait. And there it is. So after solving the puzzle, do birds have anything in common with dinosaurs? Absolutely. What do they all share? They all share a wishbone. And now Archaeopteryx, which is the species that is now extinct, has shafted feathers. But this species is closely related to our modern day birds here. Okay, so you're going to go ahead and complete the next two. I'm going to go ahead and move on to mission 3. Okay, so now we're going to be building trees that are based off of DNA. For the previous 2 missions, we've been working on building trees based off of characteristics, traits, physical traits that these species share with one another. And so DNA spells evolution. Now we're going to look at the genetic code, the molecules that code for the traits that these species have, including that we have. So the thread of DNA ties together all life on Earth. Use it to investigate how very different organisms, big and small, are related. So let's learn about how DNA spells evolution.
If Darwin came back today, what would he be most excited by in modern science? I think it would be the whole world of genetics. That's the answer to all the big questions he had. How does variation emerge? And how could that be transmitted?
Let's return to our brown bears stranded in the Arctic to consider the impact of genetics on our understanding of evolution. Each bear is made up of cells, and if we take a brown bear cell and tunnel into its nucleus, we find DNA, the molecule with the genetic instructions for building, in this case, a brown bear, written in a 4-letter code. Now, the thing about DNA, it's not perfect. When it's copied, mistakes get made. Mutations, in other words, that sometimes affect an organism's traits.
Okay, so I want to point out what was just mentioned there. Mutations. Mutations are very important for evolution to happen. Mutations are what create genetic variation. However, these mutations have to happen in the cells that lead to offspring in order for them to be able to be passed down from generation to generation. So these mutations, they're just mistakes that happen in the DNA. Sometimes those mutations can be beneficial, meaning that it can enhance an individual's ability to survive and reproduce more. Sometimes they might not have any effect at all on the species. And then sometimes they can be detrimental, meaning that they'll lead to the death of that individual. So the mutations that allow evolution to happen are the ones that provide some type of advantage. And it's not like if a species can just tell itself, come on, DNA, mutate so you can help me survive. It doesn't work that way. Mutations are random. They just happen randomly.
affect an organism's traits and that sometimes can be passed from parent to offspring. So the variation at the heart of evolution, it's genetic variation. Slight differences in DNA that, for example, could make some bears a bit lighter in color, a bit more
Some
insulated
mutations
against
there.
the cold, and a bit more capable
more
of
mutations
digesting
here.
fattier foods like seals.
Evolution is essentially any change in the genetic composition of a population.
Mutations are random, so they're not always helpful, but the bears with mutations that gave them some advantage for Arctic living survived and reproduced more often than bears without them. They passed the genes responsible for those adaptations onto their cubs. Over generations, more bears inherited and elaborated on these and other changes in the DNA. The eventual result, a polar bear. And when we tunnel into its cells, we find polar bear DNA. These days, most scientists use DNA sequences to build phylogenetic trees of living organisms. Their analyses get complicated fast because DNA can mutate rapidly and unpredictably throughout the genome.
One thing that I want to point out as you're looking at this visual of a phylogenetic tree, a tree that's built off of genetics, this is how we determine the evolutionary relatedness of species, including species like COVID, right? I'm sure you guys have probably learned on the news that there's new variants of COVID going around that could be more deadly. Evolution works on viruses too. It works, it just happens in every living thing. Well, viruses are not considered living, right, by our definition. Nature doesn't really care what we call it, though. It still happens in them. And so we can compare the DNA of a COVID strain that's circulating and more common among people here and compare it to strains in other places. But we need to be able to look at the DNA. When we look at that DNA, it allows us the ability to be able to figure out how closely related they are, which one's more closely related to the one that's circulating here. So we can learn a lot of information, and it's actually really important to know this information because it's going to determine whether or not the vaccines that we're using are going to be able to be effective against this new variant. So pretty cool stuff.
So we've simplified things for our puzzles. Use the magnifying glass to compare the actual DNA of different species. We've selected small fragments from much longer sequences for you to analyze. The numbers beneath the DNA sequences correspond to the position of each nucleotide. Instead of using physical traits as we did in previous puzzles, we're using nucleotides and their corresponding position numbers. Often, one of the species will be what's called an outgroup. You can think of it as the reference to compare all the other species against. So it goes to one side of the tree. And here's the basic rule.
The more closely related two species are, their DNA is also going to be very similar.
And the more time that's passed from when two species split off from one another, the more time there's been for mutations to accumulate, so the more different the DNA will be. Think of DNA as the raw material that, across billions of years, evolution has molded and built into countless forms of life. We are all related, tied to one another by the most spectacular of double helical threads.
Okay, so let's go ahead and get started building our first phylogenetic tree, meaning it's a tree that's built off of genetics. Okay, for this and all DNA puzzles, use the magnifying glass to compare the DNA sequences of the species. So let me click on that, see what comes up. Okay, western clawed frog. This species can live in forests, marshes, rivers, lakes, and swamps. These frogs share many similarities with humans, which is why western clawed frog embryos are often used in biomedical research. Oh, I didn't know that. The coelacanth. Scientists thought that this fish went extinct 65 million years ago until a living specimen was discovered in 1938. Coelacanths have many of the same traits as their ancestors, including low-fin fishes and hinged jaws. These features once led scientists to believe that coelacanths were the closest living relatives to four-limbed animals. And then the cichlid. This fish is mostly found in the tropical climates of Central America, and it's easily identified by its bulbous head. So look at that big giant bulb on its head. The most domesticated Midas cichlids are orange. They're usually brown or gray in the wild. let's click on the magnifying glass to look at the comparison. So here it compares the Midas cichlid. Here I see there's a C. For the coelacanth, there's a C and a T, and the clawed frog, there's a C and a T. Oh, so it looks like the cichlid is the one that looks a little bit more different, or that has DNA that's more different than the coelacanth and the clawed frog, but they all have this C that they share with one another. The coelacanth and the clawed frog have this T that they share here in this position in the DNA. Okay, so I'm going to drag these. Oh, I can click here to compare the DNA. Okay, this is going to be useful. Let me put this here. So there's that same information that came up. So C, position 2. So this is position 1. Position 2 is where the C's at, and then position 3, here's where the CTT is. Now, the Midas cichlid is the one that has all C's. So this is the one that's going to be a little bit different. So I'm going to want to group the coelacanth and the frog together because they share a T at position 3. Okay, but all of them do have a C at position 2 in the genetic code. So I am going to put the similarity, this characteristic, on the very bottom of the tree because all of these species share that trait. Okay, and since the coelacanth and the clawed frog both share a T at position 3, I'm going to put this characteristic specific to them. And there it is. There is my first phylogenetic tree. The DNA sequence of the West Indian Ocean coelacanth is closest to which species? So the coelacanth is closest to the frog. There we go. All right. So I want you to try out building your own phylogenetic tree for the second and the third one. All right, everybody, you can do this. Figure out who's closely related to who and have fun doing that.